All right, I want to take a few minutes to define GDP, gross domestic product. Simply put, it is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given period of time. And that seems fairly simple, but I want to kind of highlight a couple things. One, it is the market value. Okay, only market prices count, and only things that are exchanged in markets count. Your mother probably does your laundry. That's a valuable service, but it's not in GDP because it's not exchanged in a market. Also, it's all final goods and services, not intermediate goods. When the baker buys flour to make bread and sells the bread, he doesn't count the flour in GDP because he'd be double counting when he sold the bread. It's goods and services within a country. All right, so importantly, a Nissan made in Tennessee is in American GDP. A Ford Fiesta made in Mexico is not in American GDP. What does GDP exclude? Well, it excludes all financial transactions because that's just pieces of paper. We're trying to measure production, and financial transactions don't really have anything to do with production. So there are three kinds I've listed here. One is public transfer payments. That's like Social Security. Social Security payments, that's the public, the government transferring wealth from one person to another, from a working young American to an elderly retiree, for example. Private transfer payments, that's when maybe your grandmother gives you money. The private transfer of wealth from one person to another. There's still no production associated with that. And even stock and bond market transactions in the hundreds of millions of dollars. There's no production. They're just pieces of paper floating around. So financial transactions don't count. Secondhand sales don't count. We're trying to measure GDP within the given year. So if you buy a very expensive car but it's 3 years old, not in GDP. Same is true of used houses. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, intermediate goods don't count. Unless you're stockpiling the intermediate good at the end of the year with which to make final goods and services in some point in the future, then we'll count it as inventory. More about that in a minute. Let's talk about the components of GDP. Fortunately, there are only four. GDP is composed of four things: consumption, which is spending by households on goods and services, hamburgers, cheeseburgers, pizza, clothes, washing machines, haircuts, with the exception of new housing. When a household buys a used house, that doesn't count at all, but when they buy a new house, we include that. That's the only household purchase we include in the next category, investment. Investment is spending on capital equipment, usually by businesses. They're buying robots, building factories, and a new house is really a piece of capital to provide a household with the service of housing. So we include that. Also, inventories, as I mentioned, if you're stockpiling an intermediate good for future use, we'll include that as investment as well. Number three, government purchases, spending on goods and services by, importantly, local, state, and federal governments. And the fourth component is net exports, things we produce to sell to foreigners. And since we include that, we have to necessarily subtract out the things that we buy from foreigners. So it's net exports. It's exports net of imports. It's exports minus imports. All right, so let's run through some examples. Because interest rates increased, businesses cut back on spending for new machinery. How does that affect GDP? Well, clearly that's going to be in the investment category, and businesses are spending less on investment, therefore total GDP will go down. Due to increased incomes, Europeans buy more U.S. goods and services. Well, if Europeans are buying more U.S. goods and services, that means our exports are rising, and therefore net exports is rising, and therefore GDP is also going up. Consumers feel good about the future and take out loans to buy more durable goods, such as washing machines. Well, then clearly consumers are spending more, consumption's going up, and therefore total GDP is going up. To stimulate the economy and provide jobs, the government builds more bridges in California. That's the government spending, and so clearly government spending is going to go up and GDP is going to go up. Now sometimes people think, well, but if the government's doing that with borrowed money, is that bad? Well, maybe in the long run, but it's spending nonetheless, and government spending increases GDP. Decreases in interest rates encourage businesses to take out loans to construct more buildings. Well, businesses are going to construct buildings. That means they're going to be constructing capital, like factories and office buildings. In fact, almost all investment spending is done with borrowed money, so lower interest rates would encourage that. So investment goes up, and of course, GDP goes up. Due to a tax increase, consumers decrease purchases on vacation travel. That's very clear. Consumption is going to go down. Households are buying less vacation travel, which is a consumer good, and therefore GDP as a whole will go down. Increasing prices in the U.S. encourage Americans to buy more foreign goods. Well, if we're buying more foreign goods, that means imports are going up. But notice the net exports is exports minus imports. So net exports, the whole category, will therefore go down because we're making the negative bigger, and therefore GDP as a whole will go down. And finally, worried about an increasing budget deficit, the government decides to buy fewer military planes. It's very clear what's happening here. Government spending is going down, and when that happens, GDP goes down.